Okay, welcome back to part 4, where we're going to write the ngrx-effects to make those network requests in the API service. First things first, I'm just going to modify the actions and just rename the properties here. I'm going to call this user, and it's going to take a type of user, which we defined in the API service, so that looks like this. So we're just defining a model for our user type with an email and a username, and then a user setting just has a subscription, or these are just arbitrary values that I came up with. So we've got that there. And then we also have settings actions, where I'm going to call this user setting, and that's going to be a user setting, just like that. Cool. And now let's open the effects. User effects already been created, and let's have a look at user actions. I like to call my effects by the same name as the action that's dispatched them, so load users in this instance. So we want public load users, and we use the dollar convention after load users to show us an observable, and it should be of type observable, and it should be an action which comes from ngrx-store. And with this we want to assign it to the create effect method, which is provided by ngrx. First parameter we pass a function, and then within that function we return this .actions.pipe, and it's going to be of type load users. So just to note, I like to set up this boilerplate first for an action, for an effect even, and then have a look at the tests. So let's switch over to the test file, where we're going to describe and load users. And we want it should make a request. Cool. So right now, what's happening is we're dispatching, or we're listening for actions to dispatch the load users action, and then do nothing else. So we're also going to find that this effect returns the load users action. So let's implement a test for that. So we've got our marbles, where we're going to have a constant for the actions. So some time passes and the action is dispatched, and then we've got our expected actions, which is some time passes, or the same amount of time passes, and then we have some more data. So here I'm going to define the data. So the action is going to be load users, like that. And then now I like to keep my tests in the same kind of format. So under spies, even though this technically isn't a spy, I'm going to assign actions, which is this variable here, and we pass into the provide mock actions factory method. This is provided by ngrx to allow us to test. So basically, we define our actions variable there, and then this means when we assign anything to actions, it's going to pass it into our ngrx effects. So here, it's going to be a hot observable, so it's subscribed to immediately. We want to pass in actions, and we want A to equal action. Then we want to expect effects dot load users to be observable of, it's going to be a cold observable, and we want these expected marbles, and we want A to be action. And then you can see our tests are passing. We've got green down the side, so let me just save that. And what we actually want to do is we actually want to make a request from our API service. So let me just take a look at that again. And it's the get user request that we want to make, and it's on the API service. So to make that request, we need to pass in a dependency to our effects. So I'm going to have a private variable, a private dependency, sorry, called API service. That's API service. And now you'll probably notice straight away our tests are failing, and that's because we've got this error up the top here that we need to supply API service. So I always like to mock my dependencies, so I can do that by, instead of just providing the service here, I can use the Angular syntax, which is provide API service, and I want to use value. I'm using value because I use TS Mockito to mock my service. If you were to create an API service mock, you need to use class here. So I want to get an instance of a mock of API service. So now tests are passing again, which is great. Now I know that I want to make a request next, so I'm going to start by mocking that request. So let's put some marbles in for that. We've got request, which we are going to have pass some time, and then we're going to pass some time and then some data returns. Just a note on the request, it's not going to be subscribed to because it's a cold observable until the action here is triggered. So I like to use a space there to represent that. And I'm going to expect A to be returned once that observable has finished, or that request has completed. I'm going to also pass in a complete marker here, and the brackets signify that this all happens on the same frame. So our tests are failing right now, and I'm going to show how we can make those pass. Oh, and just one other thing, we don't want to return the action here, we want to return the success action. So success action is going to be load user success. And actually, what I changed earlier while we're getting the red line under is that load user success expects a user as one of its properties. So I'm going to define some mock data here. We'll have user. You can normally define this type like this, and pass in user there and then equals. But when testing, I like to inherit its type by doing as user. And then that way we don't necessarily need to implement all the properties on that object. So in this case, I can just pass in the email address. Email-address.com, for example, and then user inherits the type of this object, which I specified as user. So here I'm going to expect load user success to have user in the payload, and I want success action to be my expected observable. So we're still going to fail here. So now let's implement this. We need to implement the request. Oh, I need to spy on the request as well. Spy on. So let's take a look. It's called API service. This is effects. Because it's a private variable, I need to use these square brackets here. And then for the second parameter, I'm going to pass in get user. And I want to return a value of a cold observable, which has got the request marbles. And the data is going to be a user. So that's basically saying a frame passes, and then at the same time we're going to dispatch A and the complete marker, and A is going to be a user. So now let's implement that. I use exhaustMap for, well, in this instance, this request, because it will ignore any other incoming requests that happen whilst the other one's in progress. So we'll see that in the test shortly. So exhaustMap expects me to return an observable. So that's going to be this API service .get user, and I actually made it so get user required a username, so we'll just call it my user in this instance. And that's not complete just yet because I want to return the success action. So when this API service .get user completes, I want to map that to my load user success action. And I also want the data from get user, which is a user, to be passed into load user success, like so. Now you'll find tests are passing again, which is great. So let me explain more about the exhaust map. So let's say the request took quite a long time, and in the meantime, some other actions. Oh, before we do that, I just need to ensure the test passes because that's going to return at the same time, at this time. So yeah, so say that request takes some time to execute, and then in the meantime, some more actions are dispatched. The tests still pass because we're just dispatching actions, and they're essentially getting ignored by exhaustMap. So as soon as we get up to here, we're okay. If we dispatch one more action, we're going to have our test fail, and that's because now A is triggering another request, which is all of these time frame and then another A here. So I'm going to expected to then have a whole load more of those, and we're one out. Oh, wrong way. So test pass now. So if you see what I did there, I put one too many markers in, and it says that frame is expecting to be 180 instead of what I've got, 190. So I can show a difference there, and yeah, we can see that all the data is the same, but the only difference is the frame. So that's a bit overkill for a test, so I'm just going to change it to the fact that 2 actions might dispatch, and we're expecting, let's see, we want that request to take some time, and then we don't want that one at the end. Cool, so it does the passing like that. So we're just testing exhaustMap with these two actions being dispatched, and the first one taking some time and then dispatching the result for us. So that's the request being made successfully, and we could actually also expect our getUser method to have been called. So we can do that by exhaustEffects API service. Show next. .getUser to have been called with, and we only pass in a string here, and that would obviously normally be some data. So we'd expect it to be called with my user, and we'll also expect it to only have been called once. So again, that's testing the exhaustMap is working as expected. The next thing we want to do under user actions, we have the failure action as well. So if there is a failure, we want to test for that. So let's do that now. Because we're mocking this network request here, I like to have my failure in a separate test case. So in this instance, we're not going to have a look at exhaustMap. We're just going to have some time pass, and then we use the hash to represent an error. And now our tests are failing, and we want this. We basically want action to dispatch, some time to pass, an error is fired, and then expected should be A, which we're going to change to a failure action. So let's change the name of this, failure action. And this should be load users failure. And we want to define an error, which is just going to be not a string at this point, new error, failed to load, or something like that. And if we just take a look at the load users failure, we're expecting an error here. So I pass in that error like that, and we want our effects to be observable failure action. And we would expect API service.getUser still to have been called. So let's take a look at what's happening now. We've got that error here, and can we see? So notification kind E, because we're actually throwing an error, and we're expecting it to be an action at the moment. We want to catch that error basically. So let's go back to our code here, and we can use the operator catch error. And now catch error does just catch the error as a string, so we need to return an observable. So we do that by returning of, and then load users failure, and then we can pass in that error like that. Cool. So let's just take a look at what's going on here. So yeah, error, typical error. So yes, I've forgotten to actually pass the error correctly in the getUser method. So at the moment, we've got request-marbles, which are these, and we're triggering an error. So A is redundant now, so we can just pass in nothing here, or actually none. And the third argument of a cold observable or hot observable is the error, so I'm going to pass in error here. And now our tests are passing, so we've got getUser is still being called, it's been called once, but this time it's returning an error, and then we're expecting our load users to equal that failure action. And we don't need user here. So the get settings or get user settings is going to be basically the same, and I've done that on purpose so I can show you in the next video how we can refactor that to avoid some duplicate code. So let's copy this, call load user setting. So let's take a look, or settings. Or load settings it's called actually. And then we have of type load settings. Cool, so I've got that, and let's duplicate this. Load settings. Just going to whiz through this, and yeah, we're not going to expect it to call getUser, we're going to expect it to call getUser settings. The same down here. You'll see, I'm doing this on purpose, there's a lot of duplication. Yeah, the next video we'll see how this can be a little easier. No params, so we just expect it to have been called. Can actually just do that. Oh. So, yeah, load settings down here. So when we trigger the load settings action, we want to call get user settings. We don't want any parameters, and then we want to load settings success. And let's just see that takes a user setting. So here we can see the type is user setting. So great, let's pass in the user setting there. And then if we fail or there's an error, we want to load settings failure. And now let's just go ahead and make sure those tests pass as expected. So let's take a look at the first one. So we need to spy on get user settings. Let's take a look at API service. Get user settings. Spy on get user settings, and then here we want to do the same. And then our success action we want to be load settings success. And we want to pass in, we want to mock our data, so a user setting, and that's got a subscription, which is a number. Subscription, so let's call it 1. And we want user setting to be there. And then we want to mock our request with user setting. And of course, we actually want to change the action which we're dispatching here to load settings. Now they're passing. And we want to do the same here. So we want to dispatch load settings, and we want load setting failure. And we want to, yes, done all that. And those tests are passing. So that's how ngrx-effects set up. In the next video, we're going to have a look at refactoring this with a custom operator to make it a little easier.